The Battuta update brings balancing to 25 different cultures in humankind, and that's what we're going to discuss in this video today. From the early eras right the way through to the contemporary era, they've left no stone unturned. Just like as we surge towards hopefully 25,000 subscribers by next month, I would appreciate it if you would not leave that red button unturned. Thank you very much to everybody who subscribed over the last few weeks in particular. And thank you to the channel members, patrons, and subscribers on Twitch for keeping this gravy train rolling. Now, let's discuss these very exciting changes, era by era, coming to the cultures of humankind. And what is the greatest rework we've seen, I think, since the launch of the game. I'll keep them on screen, by the way, down the bottom left corner while I discuss them, but I'll also throw them up like this at the start so you can pause or read them or what have you. In the ancient era, first and foremost, and one that they made particular point to talk quite a lot about, we have the Phoenicians. The Phoenicians' legacy trait loses the early naval tech cost reductions. So you no longer get those technologies cheaper earlier. Now instead you gain +1 combat strength and +1 movement and speed on naval units. That is a really significant upgrade. The unique unit becomes a naval transport unlocked with fishing, 13 combat strength, 2 movement speed. And that's buffed further by that trait that I just talked about. They also gain access to the Pentaconter, tried to say it right first time, and their EQ gains +1 food worker slot. So fantastic buff for the Phoenicians. A little bit lighter on detail for the rest, but still just as spicy. The Hittites' legacy trait, tech cost reduction to the wheel, is replaced with +20 to FIMS per occupied city on each of their own cities. The effect ends with the end of the war. So when you're occupying cities, you get +20 food or industry, money or science per occupied city. That's a significant buff for the Hittites, providing you're at war. Assyrian Danu now counts as a commons quarter, nice for unlocking some civics earlier on, potentially a small buff. The Mycenaeans' EQ loses the additional industry bonus. That's a shame. That was very strong. And the Olmecs get a buff. The Olmec gang should rejoice. Man alive, with the buffs recently to aesthete cultures, some other changes to reduced costs for attaching outposts and merging cities in this update, which, by the way, I'll cover the full sweeping changes of this update in a separate video. The Olmec's EQ now receives +3 influence per territory, up from +1. That is a decent buff. So the Olmecs are coming out looking fairly pretty. The Hittites also probably looking good for their warlike state. The Phoenicians really benefit from Era 1. Moving through into era number 2, you can see that there are a couple of highlights here, both the Romans and the Goths. So let's start from the top. Firstly, the Romans. Their EQ, reminder, that's their unique district, now permanently gives +5 influence and +5 stability for each adjacent district. This is a significant upgrade. And it also now counts as a commons quarter, which it always should have, kind of feels like. Now it does. Great for unlocking those civics. It also gives +50 fame if completed while the city is victorious. If you've just been victorious in your war, your conflict, you'll get +50 fame. A really nice way to earn fame that very few cultures have in humankind to get from your district. So that's not only unique, but also a significant buff for the Romans. Their LT has a -30% upkeep reduction, and used to. Now it's been replaced with a +50% experience gain on unit. Could be useful. Lost a -30% research cost for Imperial power, so that reduction they added has now been removed. And the Praetorian Guard loses 1 combat strength. So all in all, buffed their sort of city building and civics elements and slightly reduced their warlike tendencies through getting Imperial power earlier, their Praetorian Guard strength. However, you do get that experience gain on unit. Now, moving through to the Goths, and they've also received some significant changes. Important to note here that the militarist affinity ability, which again, I'll talk about this in my overall coverage video of the update. There's simply too much to cover in detail in one place. But the militarist affinity ability was sort of tweaked and nerfed in some places, but buffed in others. Basically, not applying to this era, but militia units in later eras will cost more population to raise. They also fixed an exploit where you could create population when upgrading and disbanding them, and adjusted their ability cooldown with game speed. But also, they're no longer free to heal, so another nerf, but they can be upgraded into proper units on the anti-cavalry branch. So something to keep in mind. Either way, the Goth's trait removed the ransack combat strength bonus. That's gone. Instead, we have plus 25% of ransack gains earned as science per army unit. Interesting. I was playing a mod just recently, the Cultures of Nintendo mod. Shout out to that fantastic mod, which used a similar ability on a unit. Very cool. Very cool to see that. Provides a 50% bonus instead. It's currently bugged, so make the most of that. The Goth EQ has 3 changes. Base yields are unchanged. However, there is no stability penalty. So kind of a slight buff to its stability production, net stability production anyway. It also increases the overall ransack bounty by plus 5%. So further additional buffs to ransacking after the combat strength was nerfed, and their emblematic quarter now counts as a commons quarter. So again, easier to unlock civics, that kind of thing. The rest of the changes here are relatively light, however, still important to note. The Era 2 Plus nomads, so this applies to the Huns, but also the Mongols in Era 3, lose food as combat spoils. So the units no longer get food from winning fights, and they can now collect special pasture curiosities that spawn on plains and grassland, which give food. So a passive way for them to get food. That is fantastic, and in line with what the Bantu already have. The Huns, furthermore, their trait has an added ability of plus 5 science per unit on hostile territory. Another actually really significant buff for the Huns. I anticipate they could be quite fun, as if they weren't already. That's really nice for them. And in particular, nice for a militarist culture, another militarist culture, alongside the Goths. Now, I would note, to have a way to gain science. Lastly, in this era, we have the Garamantes, one of the DLC cultures from the Culture of Africa DLC pack. Interesting to see that they touched that. A lot of these, most of these, in fact, you'll notice, are classical cultures that were in the game by default. Either way, the Garamantes EQ has 3 changes. It now provides +1 food on exploitation on local territory. The EQ now provides +2 food per adjacent sterile tile, and it now must be built next to sterile, stony field, or rocky field. So slightly more limited, but perhaps in line with its initial intentions. Overall, relatively minor, but we are seeing significant buffs in this era to the Goths, the Huns, and I think on balance also the Romans. Nice. Moving along to Era 3, and this one is a little bit more limited. I'm just going to throw these changes down the bottom right. Now, don't forget, from the previous era, where I was talking about the Huns, we also have that same initial ability applied to the Mongols, where they lose food as combat spoils and can now collect special pasture curiosities that spawn on plains and grasslands to give them food. Furthermore, the Mongols' unique change doesn't give them science like the Huns. Instead, to their legacy trait, it's been an added ability of minus 25% vacillation cost reduction. There are further changes to vassalization cost, further reductions, basically, in the overall changes to the Battuta update to Humankind. Perhaps this will stack with that nicely. We'll have to see. Could actually be quite useful for a militarist victory, because this is, of course, applying to their legacy trait. So you'll keep this for the rest of the game. Could be a very powerful militarist come scientist build coming out of this update. We'll have to playtest that and see. I'm theory crafting already, getting ahead of myself. Let's not forget about the Aztecs, who are perhaps kind of seeing a similar treatment to the Romans, but to a lesser extent. 4 changes to their emblematic quarter. It now counts as a commons quarter. Nice. It now gives +10 stability, up from +5. Another nice bonus. It also provides double the yield while sacrificing, using that sacrifice ability, unique to the Aztecs, I think. Although I'll have to actually go back and playtest that to fully remember. Kind of like the religious sacrificing, where you get rid of a population to gain stability or whatever. And finally, the EQ provides +1 combat strength to all units per sacrificing city. So we could actually potentially have something kind of fun to stack, kind of like the Soviets light. We'll see. We'll have to see how that plays out. Again, lots of stuff to playtest. Speaking of playtesting, let's move on to era number 4, the always, in my opinion, trash era. We have 4 changes here. Firstly, Ming. Their legacy trait has had some changes, replaced +1 influence on territory with +10 influence per enacted civic. This, of course, combines well with what Ming do overall with cheaper civic costs. You can think of a religious build potentially and other things where you can get those costs even cheaper. Also, a science build will help with that too. This is a really interesting change and a very significant buff, in my opinion, from Ming. Their emblematic quarter receives two changes. Firstly, it no longer provides stability, but counts as commons quarter instead. In my opinion, I don't fully see how those 2 points relate. Maybe they're just two separate things. I'm not sure. Like a compliment sandwich, kind of like doesn't provide stability, but don't worry, it counts as a commons quarter. Loads of other things have also started counting as a commons quarter as a separate and additional ability. So I don't know, but also, moreover, the emblematic quarter restricted +1 influence on district effect to local territory. So buffs on the trait, restrictions on the emblematic quarter for Ming. Overall, I think buffed. The Poles, relatively simple change to this militarist culture. Their emblematic quarter now counts as a commons quarter. And there's no compliment sandwich involved. You just get that benefit. Wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Exciting nonetheless, or in all seriousness. A very minor but important buff to militarist culture and humankind. Would have been interesting if there was maybe a scientist. I don't know if it fits with the history particularly well, but would be interesting to see that scientist militarist sort of combination and affinity roll through from earlier eras. Maybe. The Venetians are also changed. Nice. 3 changes. Their trait added +1 influence per trade route to the existing effect. That's actually that's decent. I like that. Their emblematic quarter +2 money base yield up from +1 and +2 influence per adjacent district was +1 per market quarter before. So the Venetians overall nicely buffed. And last but not least, Spain, small changes but important ones. Their emblematic quarter now gives stability, only +5, so what the Aztec district used to do. But importantly, this is up from -10, so it's actually a net change of 15 stability. Their quarter also now counts as a commons quarter. This is a common theme. That's right. Uh, and that is all that we have for the early modern era, Humankind's era number 4. Moving through to era 5, we have 4 cultures changed in the industrial era. And there are some that I'm quite excited about here, some important changes as well. Here's looking at you, Frenchie. Let's move through and take a look at these now. First and foremost, Ethiopia. Again, cultures of Africa. DLC culture, and somewhat of an underwhelming one, let's be real. The legacy trait, the LT, has received 2 changes, and the emblematic quarter has as well. The legacy trait effect has been boosted to +10 science on garrison, up from +5. Again, some extra science for those militarists. The legacy trait gains combat strength of hostile units within borders gained as science. That is really interesting. So invading units, this combines well, of course, with their very defensive emblematic quarter. Their combat strength is granted to you as science. You now also receive +10 science on your garrison, up from +5. Neat. And of course, the emblematic quarter now counts as a commons quarter, and it now properly, as intended, counts as a garrison. It really always ought to have. Now it does that. It also counts as a commons quarter. Let's not forget, we also receive +10 science on garrisons, up from +5. So some really nice synergy. I like the buff to Ethiopia. That's really cool. Really cool indeed. Moving along, Zulu. What have you got going? 3 changes to the emblematic quarter for Zulu. It now counts as a farmer's quarter. Nice. It now serves as construction anchor like a hamlet. So what that means is you can build other districts around it as if it were a city center, or, as they allude to here, as if it were a hamlet. Also, the emblematic quarter now gives +25 experience on new units. This used to be +10. So that's actually quite a decent upgrade, to be fair. And moving swiftly along to one that I'm very pleased about, the French. Oh, the French. They've had their ups and downs. Their emblematic quarter now loses the collective minds effect. That's actually a good thing, I believe, because that was ring fencing it into sort of only working with collective minds or something along those lines. Now I'm a poet and I didn't even know it, but more importantly, it's been sort of let loose a little bit more, in line with roughly probably where it should be. It also gains +2 science. So the emblematic quarter, mind you, we can build many of these, gains +2 science per trade route. So this is a really decent stackable ability, doesn't rely on collective minds or a trait or anything like that. Nice overall sweeping change to the French culture. Sweet. And last but not least, the Russians in the industrial era. Their legacy trait receives 3 changes. Firstly, it loses its old effects. Whoop. Secondly, it gains -25% outpost cost creation. Interesting. Somewhat late in the game in the industrial era, although of course not too late. New world, etc., etc. And it also +10 fortification on settlements. I'll have to playtest this one because I'm not sure. I'm not sure how the fortification on settlements actually works. How much is it by default? That kind of thing. I'm not across that detail at all, really. More broadly, I also wonder how well that fits within the industrial era, and so I'll have to playtest that a little bit to check whether that cheaper outpost creation cost and then increased fortification on settlements has a profound impact on the playability of the Russian culture within the industrial era. Important to note, of course, it is a legacy trait, so it will maintain through the contemporary era, but again, maybe the same problem. Speaking of the contemporary era, let's take a look at the 5 sweeping changes made to cultures in humankind's contemporary era. First and foremost, the USSR, a logical flow through from talking about the Russians in the previous era, received but one change, a slight nerf to the USSR. Their resource now only applies its combat strength bonus. A reminder, you can build arms factories in every territory. They reduce your stability, but provide +1 combat strength. This bonus is now only applied if the unit is supplied. The supply mechanic is again one that I'm not fully across all of the different ways to interrupt or disengage supply. But this is a nice overall change that at least they have to be connected to the resource to get its benefit. Makes sense. Next, we have a big one, and one that we've talked about a lot on Humankind live streams here on the channel. It's the Americans. Lot of changes to the Americans. Emblematic quarter in particular. Let's go. So, the emblematic quarter loses strength on adjacent unit buff. So it no longer provides extra strength on adjacent units. That was kind of inconsequential a lot of the time. It now no longer reduces stability. So that's a positive effect. Nice. It gains gold synergy with garrisons. Interesting. Garrison perhaps somewhat underutilized overall, but decent enough. It now counts as a market quarter. It now counts as a commons quarter? Sign as a question mark. I'm not quite sure why. Maybe they're not quite sure if it's worked in the patch or not, but it's intended to count as a commons quarter, I suspect. Either way, that's nice that it counts as both of them. A reminder, of course, at this stage in the game, you've probably stacked quite a few bonuses, whether it's your civics or legacy traits or what have you, on different types of district. This now counts as 2 different types. And also, finally, gives +3 bombardment strength. That's a global bonus. So it's not just to adjacent units or anything like that. They say in brackets, yes, this is global. The rockets' red glare and the bombs bursting in the air. That's on theme. I like that. Interesting. Might make the Americans a little bit more worth a go now. Will it make them super crazy overpowered? No, because I don't see any stupidly significant buffs to any FIMS yields, except for those changes to what the EQ counts as. But with the bombardment strength, we could definitely see some fun out of them. Moving along, speaking of ridiculous yields, Japan, their emblematic quarter loses the explicit synergy effect with makers and research quarters, provided by infrastructures through counts as. So it loses the explicit synergy effect through counting as, bonus provided by infrastructures, with makers and research quarters. A little bit wordy. I'll playtest that one a bit. And the EQ is also now restricted +2 science and +2 industry effects to local territory. So a little bit of a nerf for you, Japan. The Turks' trait is buffed to give +3 food per population, up from 1. The Turks, again, a culture that was wildly overpowered, then perhaps a little underpowered. Now, maybe seeing them level out and also slightly lean more in towards what they do best, food, or at least what they ought to as an agrarian. +3 food per population, up from 1. Maybe Argentines into the Turks. I don't know. We'll have to see. And then last but certainly not least, the Brazilians. Their EQ gains +3 science per adjacent farmer's quarter, gains +1 researcher's slot, and it now counts as a research quarter. Nice. Interesting sort of shift, kind of turning them into what the Turks were in the early release version of Humankind, perhaps. Also, of course, as I mentioned earlier, there are a whole load of sweeping other changes coming in this update. I'll cover them fully in a separate video because we're already over the 20-minute mark. However, it's important to note that a whole load of religious districts, like the Aztec one, the Mayan one, now count as religious districts, and some religious tenets have been buffed too. More on that in my next video. See you next time.